What happens when two of the world's most elite military forces come face to face in an unexpected encounter that nobody saw coming? In the heart of London, during a routine diplomatic visit, a simple misunderstanding escalated into a tense military standoff that would test the limits of protocol, respect, and brotherhood between warriors from different nations. This is not just another military story. This is the true account of Staff Sergeant Marcus "Tank" Rodriguez, a battle-hardened Marine with 3 tours in Afghanistan, and Guardsman James Whitfield of Her Majesty's Coldstream Guards, whose family had served the Crown for 4 generations. What started as a minor security confusion during a state dinner became a defining moment that would challenge everything both men thought they knew about duty, honor, and what it truly means to serve. The crowd that gathered that evening expected to witness a diplomatic ceremony. Instead, they became silent witnesses to a confrontation that would be talked about in military circles for years to come. 2 warriors, each representing centuries of military tradition, found themselves locked in a battle of wills that had nothing to do with weapons and everything to do with respect, understanding, and the unspoken code that binds all soldiers together. What you're about to read is the complete, unfiltered account of that extraordinary evening, told through the eyes of those who were there, the decisions that were made in split seconds, and the aftermath that nobody could have predicted. This is more than a story about military protocol. This is a story about human connection in the most unlikely circumstances, and how sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting, but from understanding. The evening air in London carried the crisp bite of early October as Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his dress blue uniform one final time. The gold buttons gleamed under the streetlights of St. James's Palace, each one polished to perfection according to Marine Corps standards that had been drilled into him since boot camp 15 years ago. At 33, Marcus had seen more combat than most Marines twice his age, with 3 tours in Afghanistan and countless missions that remained classified. Tonight, however, his battlefield was different. Tonight, he was part of the security detail for a high-profile diplomatic dinner between American and British officials. Marcus stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with broad shoulders that filled out his uniform perfectly. His dark hair was cut in a regulation high and tight, and his brown eyes held the steady gaze of a man who had learned to read danger in the smallest details. A scar ran along his left jawline, a souvenir from an IED explosion in Helmand Province that had taken out his Humvee and nearly cost him his hearing. The Purple Heart ribbon on his chest told only part of his story. The real story was written in the way he carried himself, the way his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings, and the way his right hand instinctively checked the position of his sidearm, even though this was supposed to be a peaceful diplomatic function. The assignment had come down through official channels 3 weeks ago. The Secretary of Defense was attending a private dinner with British military leaders to discuss joint operations and intelligence sharing. Marcus had been handpicked for the security detail not because of his combat record, though that was impressive enough, but because of his ability to remain calm under pressure and his reputation for thinking on his feet. His commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Hayes, had briefed him personally. "Rodriguez, this isn't Afghanistan," she had said, leaning back in her chair behind a desk covered with operational reports. "But don't let that fool you. Diplomatic security requires a different kind of awareness. You're representing not just the Marine Corps, but the United States military. These British Guards take their protocols seriously, and they've been doing this a lot longer than we have. Show respect, follow procedures, but don't let anyone push you around either." Now, as Marcus walked through the ornate corridors of St. James's Palace, he understood what she meant. The building itself seemed to radiate centuries of military tradition. Oil paintings of long-dead monarchs looked down from gilded frames, and the marble floors echoed with the footsteps of countless soldiers who had walked these same halls. The British had a way of making their military heritage feel alive, as if the ghosts of past battles still lingered in the shadows. His earpiece crackled with the voice of Agent Sarah Thompson from the Diplomatic Security Service. "Tango 1, this is Control. Secretary's ETA, is 15 minutes. Confirm all positions secure. Marcus touched the small microphone attached to his collar. Control, this is Tango 1. American position secure. Standing by for arrival. He had been in position for 30 minutes, having arrived early to familiarize himself with the layout and coordinate with British security. The cooperation had been professional but distant. The British guards were polite, efficient, and absolutely unreadable. As he rounded a corner near the main entrance hall, Marcus nearly collided with a figure in a brilliant red tunic. The man was tall, probably 6 feet 4 inches, with the kind of military bearing that spoke of years of drill and discipline. His uniform was immaculate, from the gleaming buttons to the perfectly pressed fabric of his red coat. A bearskin hat sat precisely positioned on his head, and white gloves covered hands that held a ceremonial rifle with the kind of casual expertise that came from thousands of hours of practice. This was Guardsman James Whitfield of the Coldstream Guards, though Marcus didn't know his name yet. What he did know, instinctively, was that he was looking at a soldier. Not a ceremonial figure or a tourist attraction, but a real soldier who happened to wear one of the most recognizable uniforms in the world. James was 28 years old, the fourth generation of his family to serve in the Coldstream Guards. His great-grandfather had fought at the Somme, his grandfather had been at D-Day, and his father had served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. For the Whitfield family, military service wasn't just a job or even a calling. It was a sacred trust passed down through generations. James had grown up hearing stories of military honor, of standing fast in the face of overwhelming odds, of the responsibility that came with wearing the Queen's uniform. The two men stopped and looked at each other for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Marcus saw the ceremonial uniform, but recognized the soldier underneath. James saw the foreign military dress, but sensed the combat experience in the way the American carried himself. Neither man spoke immediately, but both understood they were in the presence of a fellow warrior. "Good evening," James said finally, his voice carrying the crisp accent of someone educated at good schools but tempered by years of military service. "I don't believe we've been introduced." Guardsman Whitfield, Coldstream Guards. Marcus nodded, appreciating the straightforward approach. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps. Part of the security detail for tonight's dinner. "Ah, the Americans," James said, and there was something in his tone that Marcus couldn't quite read. Not dismissive exactly, but not entirely welcoming either. "We weren't informed that American security would be operating independently within the palace." This was where the evening began to take an unexpected turn. Marcus felt a slight tension in his shoulders, the kind of subtle alarm that had kept him alive in hostile territory. "We coordinated with British security 2 hours ago. Agent Thompson from DSS spoke directly with your security chief." James frowned slightly, though his military bearing never wavered. "That would be Colonel Hartwell. However, I've received no updated orders regarding American personnel operating in Section C of the palace. This area is under exclusive guard jurisdiction during state functions." The problem, as both men were beginning to realize, was that they had stumbled into a gap in communication that was about to become a much bigger issue. The American security team had been cleared to operate throughout the palace, but the specific guard units responsible for different sections hadn't all received the updated protocols. James wasn't being difficult. He was following the orders he had been given. Marcus wasn't being unreasonable. He was doing his job according to his briefing. "Staff Sergeant," James continued, his voice remaining professional, but carrying an undertone that suggested this conversation was moving beyond pleasantries. "I'm going to need to ask you to remain in this position while I verify your authorization to be in this section of the palace." Marcus felt his jaw tighten slightly. In Afghanistan, when someone questioned his right to be somewhere, it usually meant trouble was about to start. But this wasn't Afghanistan, and the man in front of him wasn't an enemy. Still, the Marine Corps had taught him never to back down from a position unless ordered to do so by superior authority. "Guardsman Whitfield," Marcus replied, keeping his voice level but allowing a note of steel to enter his tone. "I appreciate your diligence, but I have my orders, and those orders include maintaining this position until the secretary arrives. I'm not moving unless my chain of command tells me to move. The two men stood facing each other in the ornate hallway, representatives of two military traditions that stretched back centuries. Neither was looking for a confrontation, but both were trained never to compromise when it came to duty and following orders. The situation was rapidly becoming more complicated than either man had anticipated. James's training told him to maintain control of his assigned sector at all costs. The Coldstream Guards had been responsible for protecting British royalty and dignitaries for over 300 years, and that responsibility wasn't something to be taken lightly. He had been taught from his first day of training that the Guards' reputation for reliability and precision was built on the absolute certainty that every guardsman would follow protocols without exception. Marcus's training told him something different, but equally uncompromising. Marines were taught to complete their mission regardless of obstacles, and his mission tonight was to ensure the secretary's security. That meant maintaining his position and his zone of responsibility, regardless of what anyone else might say. "I understand your position, Staff Sergeant," James said, and his tone remained respectful despite the growing tension. "However, I cannot allow unauthorized personnel to operate in my area of responsibility without proper verification. I'm sure you can understand that." "What I understand," Marcus replied, "is that I have a job to do tonight just like you do. I'm not here to cause problems with your protocols, but I'm also not going to compromise American security because of a communication breakdown." The standoff was developing exactly the way neither man wanted it to, but both were caught between their training, their sense of duty, and their orders. In the distance, the sound of approaching vehicles could be heard through the palace windows. The secretary's motorcade was getting closer, which meant this situation needed to be resolved quickly. James took a step closer, not aggressively, but in the way soldiers do when they want to have a serious conversation without being overheard. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I'm not questioning your competence or your right to be here in general, but I have specific orders about this section of the palace, and those orders don't include exceptions for American personnel. If there's been a miscommunication, it needs to be sorted out through proper channels." Marcus studied the British soldier's face, looking for signs of flexibility or compromise. What he saw instead was the same kind of unwavering determination he recognized in his own Marines. This wasn't a man who was going to back down easily, and that actually increased Marcus's respect for him, even as it complicated the situation. "Guardsman," Marcus said, his voice taking on the tone he used when trying to reason with local officials in Afghanistan, "I respect your position, and I respect your service. But my orders come from the United States government through the Marine Corps chain of command. I can't abandon my post because of a paperwork problem." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching from both directions. From the American side, Agent Thompson was walking quickly down the corridor, speaking rapidly into her radio. From the British side, an officer in the dark blue uniform of the Household Division was approaching with a kind of purposeful stride that suggested he had been summoned to deal with a problem. James came to attention as the British officer approached. "Sir," Guardsman Whitfield reporting, "we have a situation regarding American security personnel in Section C." The officer, a major by his insignia, looked at both men with the weary expression of someone who had dealt with diplomatic complications before. "What seems to be the problem, Guardsman?" Before James could respond, Agent Thompson arrived and immediately began speaking. "Gentlemen, we have the Secretary's motorcade approaching the main entrance in approximately 8 minutes. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez needs to be in position at Checkpoint 3 immediately." Major Harrison of the Household Division looked at the American agent with polite but firm authority. "Agent Thompson, I believe there may be some confusion about the security arrangements for this evening. Guardsman Whitfield informs me that no American personnel are authorized to operate independently in Section C during tonight's function." The situation was rapidly escalating from a simple miscommunication into a potential diplomatic incident. Both sides had valid points, both sides were following their orders, and Both sides were running out of time before the secretary's arrival would force some kind of resolution. Agent Thompson pulled out her phone and began scrolling through messages. Major, we have written confirmation from Colonel Hartwell's office authorizing American security personnel to operate throughout the palace complex. The authorization was transmitted at 14:30 hours today. I'm afraid I haven't seen any such authorization, Major Harrison replied. And until I can verify it through proper channels, I must insist that American personnel remain in designated areas only. Marcus felt the familiar tension that came before action was required. In combat situations, this was the moment when diplomacy ended and other methods began. But this wasn't combat, and the stakes were different. Still, the Marine Corps had taught him that backing down from a rightful position was never the answer. Agent Thompson, Marcus said, "What are my orders if British personnel attempt to prevent me from maintaining my assigned position?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone present understood that they were approaching a line that no one really wanted to cross, but that circumstances seemed to be pushing them toward anyway. James felt the same tension building. His training had prepared him for many situations, but not for a potential confrontation with Allied military personnel in the middle of a diplomatic function. Yet his orders were clear, and the Coldstream Guards had not maintained their reputation for over 3 centuries by failing to follow orders when things became complicated. Agent Thompson looked at her watch, then at the faces of the military men surrounding her. "Gentlemen, we have 6 minutes before the secretary arrives. I need Staff Sergeant Rodriguez in position, and I need this resolved now." Major Harrison straightened to his full height, which was considerable. "Agent Thompson, with all due respect, this is British sovereign territory, and British security protocols take precedence. Until proper authorization can be verified, the American security detail will need to adjust their positions accordingly." The standoff was now complete. 2 proud military traditions, each with centuries of history behind them, each with uncompromising standards of duty and honor, were facing each other in a situation where compromise seemed impossible and time was running out. Marcus looked at James, and for a moment he saw past the red tunic and the ceremonial rifle to the soldier underneath. He saw someone who understood duty the way he understood it. Someone who had been trained to stand fast regardless of the consequences. Someone who would rather face a court-martial than fail to follow his orders. James looked back at Marcus and saw the same thing. He saw a warrior who had earned his place through combat, someone who understood that military discipline meant never backing down when you were in the right, someone whose loyalty to his country and his service ran deeper than personal convenience. The irony wasn't lost on either man that they were about to find themselves in conflict, not because they were enemies, but because they were both exactly the kind of soldiers their respective countries needed them to be. As the sound of the approaching motorcade grew louder, both men realized that the next few minutes would test everything they believed about duty, honor, and the bonds that existed between warriors, even when they found themselves on opposite sides of an impossible situation. The tension in the ornate hallway reached a breaking point as the sound of car doors slamming echoed through the palace windows. The secretary's motorcade had arrived, and what should have been a routine security operation was about to become a test of will between 2 of the world's most disciplined military forces. Marcus could feel his heart rate increasing, not from fear, but from the familiar surge of adrenaline that came when a situation was about to require decisive action. His right hand moved instinctively closer to his sidearm, not in a threatening manner, but in the automatic response of a combat veteran who had learned to prepare for any possibility. Across from him, James noticed the subtle movement and responded with an almost imperceptible shift in his own stance, bringing his ceremonial rifle into a more ready position. Agent Thompson was speaking rapidly into her radio, her voice tight with stress. "Control, this is Agent Thompson. We have a security protocol conflict at Checkpoint 3. I need immediate clarification on authorization codes." She paused, listening to the response. "Negative, Control. The secretary is already inside the building. We need resolution now. Major Harrison stepped between the two enlisted men, his experience as an officer telling him that this situation was moments away from becoming something that would require official reports and diplomatic apologies. Gentlemen, I propose we escort the American sergeant to the designated American security area while we sort out the paperwork. This doesn't need to become a confrontation. Marcus shook his head firmly. Sir, with respect, my orders are clear. I maintain this position until relieved by my chain of command. Moving to a different position compromises the Secretary's security envelope. James spoke for the first time in several minutes, his voice calm, but carrying unmistakable authority. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I understand your commitment to your orders, but this is my post assigned to me by my commanding officer, and I cannot allow unauthorized personnel to operate here regardless of their reasoning. The two men were now facing each other directly, less than 3 feet apart. Neither was being aggressive, but both were absolutely firm in their positions. It was a standoff between two professional soldiers who had been trained never to compromise when it came to duty and following orders. Agent Thompson ended her radio conversation and turned back to the group. Her face was flushed with frustration and the pressure of time running out. Major Harrison, I've just been informed that the authorization paperwork was sent to the wrong department. It's going to take at least 20 minutes to route it correctly and get confirmation. 20 minutes? Major Harrison's eyebrows rose. Agent Thompson, the dinner begins in 15 minutes. The guests are already arriving, which is exactly why I need Staff Sergeant Rodriguez in position now, she replied, her professional composure beginning to crack. We can't provide adequate security with gaps in our perimeter. Marcus found himself caught between loyalty to Agent Thompson, who was responsible for the overall security operation, and respect for James, who was simply following his orders just as any good soldier would. The Marine Corps had taught him that honor mattered more than convenience, and there was honor in both positions. Agent Thompson, Marcus said carefully, what happens if I don't maintain this position? What's the real security risk? She pulled out a tablet and showed him a diagram of the palace layout. This corridor provides access to 3 different routes to the main dining hall. If we don't have coverage here, anyone could approach the Secretary's party from multiple angles without being detected until they're already inside the security perimeter. James leaned forward to look at the diagram, his curiosity overcoming his caution. As a professional soldier, he understood security concerns even when they involved people he was currently in disagreement with. What he saw on the tablet made him frown. I wasn't aware that this corridor had multiple access points to the dining hall, he said to Major Harrison. Our briefing indicated that Section C was primarily ceremonial space with no direct access to the function areas. Major Harrison looked at the diagram more closely, his expression growing troubled. Agent Thompson, this shows architectural details that weren't included in our security briefing. Where did this information come from? The architectural survey was completed by American Intelligence Services 3 weeks ago using ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging, Thompson explained. We identified several structural features that don't appear on the standard palace floor plans. This revelation changed the dynamic of the entire situation. James realized that the Americans weren't just being stubborn about their positioning. They had information about the palace that the British security team didn't possess. Marcus realized that James and Major Harrison weren't trying to obstruct American operations. They were working with incomplete information. Guardsman Whitfield, Marcus said, his tone shifting from confrontational to professional. If you're responsible for security in this section, you need to know that there are 3 concealed access points within 50 feet of where we're standing. 2 of them connect directly to the dining hall. James studied the American sergeant's face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. What he saw instead was the straightforward honesty of a soldier sharing critical information with a fellow professional. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, are you saying there are security vulnerabilities in this section that we're not aware of? I'm saying that your standard floor plans are about 100 years out of date, Marcus replied. The palace has been modified multiple times, and some of those modifications created security risks that don't show up on the official blueprints. Major Harrison was now looking at both men with a different expression. The situation was no longer a simple matter of conflicting orders and military pride. If the Americans had identified genuine security vulnerabilities, then the entire evening security arrangement might need to be reconsidered. Agent Thompson, the major said, I need to see all of your intelligence on the palace structure. If there are security risks we're not aware of, then we need to coordinate our response immediately. Thompson hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing the complications of sharing classified intelligence with foreign personnel against the immediate need to resolve the security situation. Major, I can share general information, but some of our intelligence methods are classified. I understand, Harrison replied. But if British security is compromised, then everyone is at risk, including your secretary. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching rapidly from the main corridor. A British soldier in the dark uniform of palace security was jogging toward them, his urgency obvious even from a distance. When he reached the group, he was slightly out of breath and clearly agitated. Sir, he said to Major Harrison, we have a problem. The metal detectors at entrance 4 have detected someone attempting to bring weapons into the palace. The individual claims to be a member of the catering staff, but his identification doesn't match our records. The announcement hit the group like a physical blow. Marcus felt his training take over immediately, his mind shifting from diplomatic concerns to threat assessment. James experienced the same transformation, his focus narrowing to the immediate security requirements of the situation. Where is the individual now? Major Harrison asked, his voice taking on the crisp authority of a combat commander. Detained at entrance 4, sir. But we've discovered that his catering company provided staff for 3 different events at the palace this month. We don't know if he's working alone or if there are others already inside. Agent Thompson was already speaking into a radio, calling for immediate lockdown protocols. Control, this is Thompson. We have a potential security breach. Initiate code red procedures immediately. Marcus turned to James, and the conflict between them suddenly seemed irrelevant compared to the threat they were now facing. Guardsmen, you know this palace better than anyone. If someone wanted to get close to the dinner guests without going through main security, what routes would they use? James didn't hesitate. The service corridors run parallel to the main halls. If someone had legitimate access to the catering areas, they could move through most of the palace without being challenged. And those service corridors connect to this section? Marcus asked. 2 of them do, James confirmed. There's an access door behind that tapestry, and another one behind the false panel near the main staircase. Marcus looked at Agent Thompson. We need people covering both access points immediately. She nodded, but her expression was grim. I can pull agents from other positions, but it's going to create gaps in our perimeter. No, James said firmly. You can't afford gaps in your perimeter, not with a potential threat already inside the building. Major Harrison was coordinating with the soldier who had brought the warning. Sergeant Morrison, I want every member of the catering staff accounted for immediately. Check their identification against the original lists and verify everyone through their employers. Sir, that could take 30 minutes or more, Morrison replied. Then we'd better get started, Harrison said grimly. Marcus found himself looking at James with a new understanding. The British guardsman wasn't an obstacle to overcome. He was a professional soldier dealing with the same threats and the same responsibilities. The ceremonial uniform and the ancient traditions didn't change the fact that James was exactly the kind of person Marcus would want covering his back in a dangerous situation. Guardsman Whitfield, Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of respect that hadn't been there before, if we're going to secure this area properly, I need to know everything you know about the access points and the sight lines. James looked at the American sergeant, seeing past the foreign uniform to the combat experience and professional competence underneath. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, if we're going to work together, I need to know what your intelligence tells you about the areas I can't see from my position. It was a moment of mutual recognition between warriors. The conflict over jurisdiction and protocols hadn't disappeared, but it had been overshadowed by the immediate need to work together against a potential threat. Both men understood that their primary loyalty was to the mission and the people they were protecting, not to institutional pride or bureaucratic procedures. Agent Thompson spread the tablet diagram on a nearby table, and both men gathered around it. "Here's what we know," she began. "There are 3 concealed access points in this section. James, you can see the main corridor from your position, but you can't see the service door behind the tapestry or the emergency exit near the staircase." Marcus pointed to specific locations on the diagram. "If I maintain my position here, I can cover both access points, but I need someone watching the main corridor." "That's my position," James said. "I can see anyone approaching from the main hall, and I can provide backup if you need it." Major Harrison looked at both men with growing respect. "Gentlemen, are you saying you can coordinate security for this section between you?" Marcus and James looked at each other, both understanding that they were about to commit to something that went beyond their original orders. They were about to trust each other in a way that required putting aside national pride, military rivalry, and personal ego. "Sir," Marcus said to Harrison, "if Guardsman Whitfield is willing to work with American intelligence on the security vulnerabilities, then I believe we can provide comprehensive coverage for this section." James nodded. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, if you're willing to coordinate with British protocols and keep me informed of any developments, then I believe we can work together effectively." Agent Thompson looked relieved for the first time since the crisis began. "Gentlemen, I need to coordinate with other security teams, but I'll leave you to work out the details of coverage for this area." As Thompson and Major Harrison moved away to deal with other aspects of the security situation, Marcus and James found themselves alone again. But the dynamic between them had changed completely. They were no longer adversaries protecting their respective territories. They were partners working toward the same goal. "Staff Sergeant," James said, "I owe you an apology. I was so focused on following my orders that I didn't consider that you might have information I needed." Marcus shook his head. "Guardsman, you don't owe me anything. You were doing your job exactly the way it should be done. If I were in your position, I would have done the same thing." The 2 men began working out the practical details of their cooperation. James explained the normal traffic patterns in the corridor, the times when staff typically moved through the area, and the sight lines from his position. Marcus shared the intelligence about the concealed access points, the potential approaches from the service corridors, and the security risks that weren't obvious from the standard floor plans. As they talked, both men began to realize that their different backgrounds and training actually complemented each other perfectly. James's knowledge of the palace and its procedures, combined with Marcus's combat experience and intelligence training, created a security team that was stronger than either man could have been alone. "You know," James said, "this situation reminds me of something my grandfather told me about working with American forces during the war." Marcus looked interested. "What did he say?" "He said that Americans and British make good partners because we both understand that the mission comes first, even when we disagree about the methods." Marcus smiled for the first time that evening. "Your grandfather was a wise man, and he was right about Americans. We might be stubborn, but we know how to work with allies when it matters." The sound of voices from the main dining hall indicated that the dinner was beginning despite the security concerns. Both men understood that their job was just getting started, and that the next few hours would test their ability to work together under pressure. But something important had changed between them. The confrontation that had threatened to become an international incident had transformed into the beginning of a partnership based on mutual respect and shared professional values. They were no longer representatives of competing military traditions. They were soldiers working together to protect innocent people from a potential threat. The real test of their cooperation was still ahead of them. The partnership between Marcus and James was tested within minutes of their agreement to work together. As the dinner guests moved through the palace corridors toward the main dining hall, Both men noticed something that immediately set their professional instincts on high alert. A member of the catering staff was moving through the main corridor with a serving cart, but his behavior was wrong in ways that were subtle yet unmistakable to trained observers. He was walking too quickly for someone pushing a heavy cart. His eyes were scanning the ceiling and walls rather than watching where he was going, and most tellingly, he was sweating despite the cool temperature of the palace corridors. James saw him first and immediately pressed the small communication device attached to his collar. "Control, this is Guardsman Whitfield. I have eyes on a catering staff member in main corridor, section C. Individual appears nervous and is not following normal service protocols." Marcus had spotted the same person and was already moving into a position where he could observe without being seen. His combat experience told him that the man was conducting reconnaissance, not performing legitimate catering duties. The way he was looking at doorways and exits suggested he was mapping escape routes rather than focusing on his assigned tasks. "James," Marcus said quietly, using the guardsman's first name for the first time. "Watch how he's handling that cart. Look at his grip on the handles." James observed more closely and immediately understood what Marcus was seeing. The man was gripping the cart handles in a way that suggested he was ready to abandon it quickly if necessary. His posture was that of someone prepared for sudden movement, not the relaxed stance of a worker performing routine duties. "He's not here to serve dinner," James confirmed. "Question is, what is he here for?" Agent Thompson's voice crackled through both men's earpieces. "All security personnel, be advised that we have confirmed the detained individual at entrance 4 was carrying components that could be assembled into an explosive device. We are now treating this as an active threat situation. All personnel are authorized to detain anyone acting suspiciously." The announcement changed everything. What had been a potential security concern was now a confirmed terrorist threat, and the suspicious catering worker was no longer just someone acting oddly. He was a potential bomb carrier in a building full of high-ranking government officials. Marcus felt his training take complete control of his actions. His hand moved to his sidearm, while his mind calculated distances, cover options, and potential civilian casualties. This was the kind of situation he had prepared for through years of combat experience. But the setting was completely different from anything he had faced before. James experienced a similar transformation, but his training was different. The Coldstream Guards had been responsible for protecting the royal family through centuries of threats, from foreign invasions to domestic terrorism. His ancestors had stood post during the Blitz while bombs fell around them, and that tradition of unwavering duty under fire was now flowing through his veins. "Staff Sergeant," James said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "If we approach him directly in the open corridor, he might panic and activate whatever device he's carrying." Marcus nodded, recognizing the tactical wisdom in James's assessment. "Agreed, but we can't let him get close to the dining hall either. We need to funnel him into a position where we can control the situation." The two men were now thinking and acting as a team, each drawing on their different but complementary training to develop a strategy. James knew the palace layout intimately, including spaces that didn't appear on any tourist maps or official floor plans. Marcus knew urban combat tactics and had experience dealing with improvised explosive devices in hostile environments. "There's a service alcove about 20 meters ahead of his current position," James explained. "If we can get him to turn into that alcove, we'll have him in a confined space away from the main corridor." "How do we get him to turn?" Marcus asked. James smiled grimly. "Leave that to me. The palace staff have been trained to respond to certain signals from the guard. If I give the right signal, he'll think he's supposed to report to the service area immediately." It was a plan that required perfect timing and complete trust between the two men. James would signal the suspect to redirect into the service alcove, while Marcus positioned himself to intercept if the plan went wrong. Both men understood that they were about to put their lives on the line based on their faith in each other's professional competence. James stepped into the main corridor, his ceremonial rifle held in the traditional guard position, but his posture and bearing conveying unmistakable authority. When the catering worker saw the imposing figure in the red tunic, he slowed his pace uncertainly. "You there," James called out in the commanding voice that Coldstream guards have been using to direct people for over 3 centuries. Service personnel report to Alcove 7 immediately for security verification. The suspect hesitated for a moment, clearly uncertain whether to comply or to run. James maintained his authoritative bearing while Marcus watched from concealment, ready to react if the situation deteriorated. For several tense seconds, the 3 men were frozen in a tableau of suspicion and preparation for violence. Finally, the suspect began pushing his cart toward the service alcove, but Marcus could see that his body language remained wrong. The man was complying, but he was also preparing for something else. His right hand kept moving toward his jacket pocket, and he was looking around as if searching for alternative escape routes. As the suspect approached the alcove entrance, Marcus moved into position behind him, using the servants' corridors that Agent Thompson's intelligence had identified. He emerged just as the man was entering the alcove, effectively trapping him between James at the entrance and Marcus blocking the rear exit. "Stop right there," Marcus commanded, his sidearm drawn, but held low to avoid creating panic among any legitimate staff who might be nearby. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The suspect spun around, his eyes wide with the kind of desperation that Marcus had learned to recognize as extremely dangerous. This was a man who had been caught, but was not yet ready to surrender, and that made him unpredictable in the worst possible way. "I'm just working," the man said, his accent revealing that English was not his first language. "I'm supposed to be here. I have authorization." James had moved to block the main exit from the alcove, his ceremonial rifle now held in a way that made it clear he was prepared to use it as a weapon if necessary. "Show us your authorization slowly, and keep your hands visible." The suspect reached toward his jacket pocket, but his movement was too quick and too aggressive for comfort. Marcus reacted immediately, stepping forward and grabbing the man's wrist before he could complete whatever action he was attempting. "Don't move," Marcus ordered, using the voice he had developed for controlling potentially hostile civilians in Afghanistan. James called for backup and bomb disposal. Now, what Marcus found in the suspect's pocket confirmed their worst fears. It was a small electronic device with a simple trigger mechanism, exactly the kind of improvised detonator that had been used in terrorist attacks around the world. The device was connected to wiring that disappeared into the man's jacket, suggesting that he was wearing an explosive vest. "We have a problem," Marcus said quietly to James. "He's wired with explosives, and he's got a dead man's switch." James immediately understood the implications. If the suspect released the trigger device, the explosives would detonate, killing everyone in the immediate area and potentially causing structural damage to the palace. They couldn't simply overpower him without risking setting off the bomb. "What's your name?" James asked the suspect, his voice taking on a calmer, more conversational tone. The Coldstream guards have been trained in negotiation techniques as part of their anti-terrorism preparation, and James was drawing on that training now. "It doesn't matter," the suspect replied, but there was something in his voice that suggested he wasn't entirely committed to dying. "You cannot stop what is happening tonight." Marcus kept his weapon trained on the suspect while studying his body language and facial expressions. His combat experience had taught him to read people who were preparing to kill or die, and what he saw was a man who was scared, desperate, but not necessarily suicidal. "What is happening tonight?" Marcus asked. "What are you trying to accomplish?" The suspect looked between the 2 soldiers, and, for a moment, his resolve seemed to waver. "You wouldn't understand. Your governments, they kill innocent people every day. Tonight, we make them understand what it feels like." James exchanged a glance with Marcus, both men recognizing that they were dealing with someone who had been radicalized, but might still be reached through reason and conversation. The challenge was keeping him talking long enough for backup to arrive while preventing him from panicking and detonating his explosives. "I've been to war," Marcus said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. I've seen innocent people die, and I've seen what happens when good people get caught up in violence. Whatever you're angry about, killing people tonight won't fix it. You don't know anything about it, the suspect replied, but his grip on the trigger device seemed to relax slightly. Your military killed my family. Your bombs destroyed my village. Marcus felt a familiar knot in his stomach. He had heard similar stories in Afghanistan, from people who had lost everything to the violence that seemed to consume entire regions of the world. Some of those people had become enemies, but others had become allies once they understood that not all soldiers were the same. Where was your village? Marcus asked. The question seemed to surprise the suspect. Why do you care? Because I've probably been there, Marcus replied honestly. I've spent 3 tours in Afghanistan, and I've seen what war does to families and communities. I'm not saying American forces never made mistakes, but I am saying that killing people tonight won't bring your family back. James watched the exchange with growing understanding of why Marcus had earned his reputation as someone who could think under pressure. The American Marine was using his own combat experience not to intimidate the suspect, but to establish a human connection that might prevent a tragedy. My village was called Karga, the suspect said quietly. It was near Kabul. American drones killed my wife and my 2 children. They said it was a mistake, but my family was still dead. Marcus felt the words hit him like a physical blow. He had been part of operations near Kabul, and he knew that civilian casualties were an unavoidable reality of modern warfare. But knowing that didn't make it easier to look at a man whose life had been destroyed by those operations. I'm sorry for your loss, Marcus said, and the sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. I can't bring your family back, and I can't undo what happened to them. But I can tell you that killing innocent people tonight won't honor their memory. James could see that Marcus's words were having an effect on the suspect, but he could also see that the man was still gripping the trigger device. The situation was still incredibly dangerous, and they were running out of time before someone would be forced to make a decision that could cost lives. What was your wife's name? James asked suddenly. The question caught both Marcus and the suspect off guard. James had noticed tears forming in the man's eyes when he talked about his family, and he was gambling that humanizing the conversation even further might break through the suspect's resolve to commit violence. Layla, the suspect said, his voice breaking slightly. Her name was Layla, and she was the most beautiful woman in our village. And your children? James continued. Ahmad was 7, and Fatima was 4, the suspect replied, and now the tears were flowing freely. Ahmad wanted to be a teacher like his mother. Fatima loved to sing. Marcus and James both understood that they were witnessing a man's grief and rage finally, overwhelming his desire for revenge. The suspect was no longer a terrorist threatening innocent people. He was a father mourning his dead children and a husband who had lost the woman he loved. The sound of approaching footsteps indicated that backup was finally arriving, but Marcus held up his hand to signal them to maintain distance. He could see that the suspect was wavering, caught between his desire for vengeance and his memory of the family he had lost. What would Layla want you to do? Marcus asked quietly. Would she want you to kill innocent people? Would she want Ahmad and Fatima's father to become a murderer? The question hung in the air for what seemed like an eternity. The suspect looked at Marcus, then at James, then down at the trigger device in his hand. For a moment, it seemed like he might still choose violence, but then his shoulders sagged and the fight went out of him. She would want me to live, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. She would want me to remember them with love, not with hatred. Slowly, carefully, he set the trigger device down on a nearby table and raised his hands in surrender. Marcus immediately secured the device while James called for the bomb disposal team. The immediate crisis was over, but both men understood that they had just experienced something profound about the nature of conflict, loss, and the choices that people make when their world has been destroyed by violence. As the bomb disposal experts arrived and began the careful process of disarming the explosive vest, Marcus James found themselves alone for a moment in the corridor outside the alcove. "That was well done," James said quietly. "I've never seen anyone defuse a situation like that through conversation alone." Marcus shook his head. "That wasn't tactics or training. That was just two fathers talking about their children." Both men understood that what they had accomplished together went far beyond their original mission of providing security for a diplomatic dinner. They had prevented a terrorist attack, saved innocent lives, and, perhaps most importantly, they had found a way to reach across the divide of hatred and violence to touch the humanity that existed even in someone who had been prepared to commit murder. The evening was far from over, and there would be reports to write, investigations to conduct, and security procedures to review. But Marcus and James had already achieved something more valuable than successful completion of their assigned duties. They had proven that cooperation, understanding, and respect for the humanity and others could overcome even the most difficult and dangerous situations. The partnership that had begun as a jurisdictional dispute had become something much deeper and more important, and both men knew that they had been changed by the experience of working together under the most challenging possible circumstances. The aftermath of the terrorist threat brought Marcus and James face to face with complications neither had anticipated. As bomb disposal experts carefully removed the explosive vest from the surrendered suspect, both soldiers found themselves at the center of an international incident that would require careful handling by diplomats and intelligence agencies for both countries. Agent Thompson approached the two men with an expression that mixed relief, admiration, and concern. "Gentlemen, what you accomplished here tonight will be studied and discussed for years to come. You've prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack. However, we now have a complex situation that goes beyond security protocols." Major Harrison joined the conversation, his bearing reflecting the same mixture of pride and worry. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Guardsman Whitfield, I want to commend both of you for exceptional performance under extremely dangerous circumstances. Your cooperation and professionalism prevented loss of life and protected critical diplomatic relations between our countries." Marcus felt a familiar unease that came after successful combat operations. The immediate danger was over, but experience had taught him that the aftermath of such situations often brought challenges that were different, but equally difficult to navigate. "What kind of complications are we looking at, sir?" Agent Thompson pulled out her secure communication device. "The suspect has requested to speak with both of you specifically. He's refusing to cooperate with interrogation unless you're both present. Given the intelligence value of what he might know about other planned attacks, your governments are very interested in accommodating his request." James frowned, understanding the implications immediately. "You're asking us to participate in intelligence-gathering operations outside our normal duties and training." "I'm asking you to consider it," Thompson replied. "The suspect has already demonstrated that he responds to both of you in ways he doesn't respond to trained interrogators. He sees you as soldiers who showed him respect and humanity rather than as representatives of governments he considers his enemies." Major Harrison added his perspective. "Gentlemen, this situation has already attracted attention at the highest levels of government. The Secretary personally requested information about the soldiers who prevented the attack. Your actions tonight reflect not just on yourselves, but on your respective services and countries." Marcus and James exchanged glances, both recognizing that they were being asked to continue their partnership under circumstances that would test their abilities in completely new ways. The tactical cooperation that had worked so well during the crisis would need to be adapted for the complex psychology of intelligence gathering. "What exactly would be required of us?" Marcus asked. Agent Thompson consulted her notes. "The suspect, whose name is Hassan al-Mansuri, has agreed to provide information about the organization that recruited him and the network that planned tonight's attack. But he insists that he will only talk to the American Marine and the British Guardsmen who prevented him from completing his mission. He sees you both as honorable soldiers who treated him as a human being rather than as an enemy," Major Harrison explained. That's apparently a rare experience for him since he began planning this attack. James considered the implications carefully. His training as a Coldstream Guard had included some preparation for dealing with security threats, but nothing that approached formal intelligence work. Are we qualified for this kind of assignment? Qualified is a relative term, Thompson replied. You've already demonstrated abilities that our trained interrogators don't possess. Hassan responded to your approach in ways that suggest he might be willing to cooperate if he continues to view you as trustworthy. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a senior British intelligence officer who introduced himself as Colonel David Sterling of MI5. His presence indicated that the situation had escalated to levels of government that neither Marcus nor James typically interacted with during their normal duties. Gentlemen, Colonel Sterling began, I've been briefed on your actions tonight, and I want to add the appreciation of Her Majesty's government to what you've already heard. However, I need to be direct about what we're facing. He pulled out a secure tablet and showed them photographs of explosive devices and technical diagrams. Hassan al-Mansuri was part of a cell that has been planning coordinated attacks on government facilities in 3 different countries. Tonight was supposed to be the first of those attacks. The intelligence he possesses could prevent significant loss of life. Marcus studied the photographs, his combat experience allowing him to recognize the sophistication of the devices shown. This wasn't a lone wolf operation. These are professional-grade explosives with complex timing mechanisms. James noticed details that his own training allowed him to interpret. The targeting appears to be specifically focused on diplomatic and government facilities. This was planned as a systematic campaign, not a single incident. Colonel Sterling nodded approvingly. Both of you have identified critical aspects of what we're dealing with. Hassan's information could help us prevent attacks on American facilities in London, British facilities in Washington, and coordinated operations in other allied countries. Agent Thompson added her perspective. The challenge is that Hassan has been conditioned to view American and British intelligence services as enemies. But he responded to both of you as soldiers who showed him respect and humanity. That distinction might be the key to gaining his cooperation. The weight of responsibility was settling on both men's shoulders. What had started as a routine security assignment had become a mission that could affect international security and potentially save hundreds of lives. Neither Marcus nor James had ever faced a situation where their individual actions could have such far-reaching consequences. What would our role be specifically? James asked. Colonel Sterling explained the proposed approach. You would serve as liaison officers during the interrogation process. Your presence might encourage Hassan to provide information he would otherwise refuse to share. You wouldn't be conducting the interrogation yourselves, but your participation could be critical to its success. Marcus felt the familiar tension that came with accepting a mission that carried significant risks and uncertain outcomes. What are the potential downsides if this doesn't work? If Hassan decides not to cooperate, we lose our best opportunity to prevent additional attacks, Thompson replied. If he provides false information, we could waste critical resources pursuing dead ends while real threats develop. Major Harrison added a military perspective. Gentlemen, you're being asked to volunteer for an assignment that goes beyond your normal duties and could potentially put you in harm's way again. You have the right to decline. The offer to decline was genuine, but both Marcus and James understood that their answer had already been determined by everything they believed about duty, service, and protecting innocent people. The same values that had brought them into conflict earlier in the evening now united them in accepting a mission that neither would have been able to handle alone. I'm willing to participate, Marcus said, but only if Guardsman Whitfield agrees to continue our partnership. James nodded firmly. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I believe we work well together, and I believe this mission is important enough to accept the risks. Colonel Sterling and Agent Thompson exchanged glances that suggested this was the answer they had hoped for, but hadn't dared to expect. The cooperation between an American Marine and a British Guardsman had already prevented one disaster. now it might be the key to preventing several more. There are some practical considerations we need to address immediately, Thompson said. Both of you will need to be briefed on interrogation protocols, intelligence security procedures, and the specific information we're hoping to obtain from Hassan. Major Harrison added his concerns. Your respective chains of command will need to be informed and consulted. This assignment will require official approval from both American and British authorities. Over the next hour, Marcus and James found themselves immersed in a crash course on intelligence operations that neither had expected to receive. They learned about psychological approaches to encouraging cooperation, the legal frameworks that govern interrogation of terrorist suspects, and the specific intelligence gaps that Hassan's information might fill. The briefing revealed the full scope of the threat they had helped interrupt. Hassan's organization had been planning a coordinated campaign designed to damage diplomatic relations between allied countries and potentially provoke military responses that would escalate regional conflicts. Tonight's attack at the palace had been intended as the opening move in a larger strategy of violence and destabilization. The sophistication of this planning suggests state sponsorship, Colonel Sterling explained. Hassan may have information about funding sources, training facilities, and other operatives that could help us dismantle the entire network. Agent Thompson showed them communication intercepts and financial records that painted a picture of an organization with international reach and substantial resources. This isn't just about preventing future attacks. The intelligence Hassan provides could help us understand how these networks operate and how to identify them before they become operational. As the briefing continued, Marcus and James began to understand that their partnership was evolving into something unprecedented in both their military careers. They were being asked to bridge the gap between military operations and intelligence work, between tactical response and strategic planning, between the immediate threat they had just neutralized and the broader campaign of violence that threat represented. The most challenging aspect of their new assignment was the psychological complexity of dealing with Hassan al-Mansuri. He was simultaneously a terrorist who had been prepared to commit murder and a grieving father whose family had been destroyed by the conflicts both soldiers had participated in. Finding a way to encourage his cooperation without compromising their own principles would require a delicate balance of empathy and professional objectivity. One more thing, Colonel Sterling said as the briefing concluded. Hassan has specifically requested that any conversations with him be conducted in an informal setting rather than a traditional interrogation room. He wants to feel like he's talking to soldiers, not being questioned by intelligence officers. Major Harrison looked thoughtful. That suggests he views your interaction with him tonight as fundamentally different from his previous experiences with Western military and intelligence personnel. Marcus understood the implications. He trusts us, or at least he trusts what he thinks we represent. The challenge will be maintaining that trust while gathering the information we need. James recognized the same challenge from a different perspective. We'll need to be honest with him about our role and our objectives. If he discovers that we're not being straightforward, we'll lose any chance of cooperation. The final details of their assignment were worked out with careful attention to both men's concerns about maintaining their integrity while serving the mission's objectives. They would participate in conversations with Hassan, not formal interrogations. They would be honest about their role in gathering intelligence, but they would approach him as fellow soldiers rather than as investigators or prosecutors. As the briefing ended and preparations began for their first conversation with Hassan, Marcus and James realized that their partnership had become something unique in both their experiences. They had moved from confrontation to cooperation to a kind of trust that transcended national boundaries and military traditions. The next phase of their assignment would test whether that trust could be extended to include a man who had been their enemy just hours before, and whether the bond they had formed as soldiers could become a bridge toward preventing future violence and saving innocent lives. The evening that had started as a routine security assignment was becoming a mission that would challenge everything both men thought they knew about duty, honor, and the possibility of finding common ground, even with those who had been prepared to destroy everything they valued. Their partnership was about to face its greatest test, not in preventing violence, but in creating the kind of understanding that might make future violence unnecessary. 6 hours after the terrorist threat had been neutralized, Marcus and James found themselves in an unremarkable conference room deep within a secure government facility in London. The ornate surroundings of the palace had been replaced by plain walls and functional furniture, but the weight of their mission felt heavier than ever. Hassan al-Mansuri sat across from them at a simple wooden table, no longer wearing the explosive vest that had made him so dangerous just hours before. He had been given clean clothes and a meal, and the medical team had treated the minor injuries he had sustained during his capture. But his eyes still carried the haunted look of a man who had lost everything and had been prepared to die for revenge. The conversation began slowly, with Hassan looking suspiciously at the recording equipment and the intelligence officers who were monitoring the session from behind one-way glass. Marcus and James had insisted that the formal interrogators remain out of sight, believing that Hassan would be more likely to cooperate if he felt he was talking to soldiers rather than being questioned by faceless government agents. Hassan, Marcus began, using the man's first name rather than treating him as a prisoner or suspect. "We want to talk to you about your family." The unexpected opening caught Hassan off guard. He had been preparing for questions about his organization, his contacts, and his planned attack. Instead, the American Marine was asking about the people whose deaths had driven him to seek revenge. "Why do you want to know about my family?" Hassan asked, his voice carrying both suspicion and grief. James leaned forward slightly, his bearing more conversational than interrogational. "Because we want to understand what brought you to tonight. We want to understand what happened to Layla, Ahmad, and Fatima." The use of his family's names had an immediate effect on Hassan. His suspicious expression softened, and, for a moment, the grieving husband and father was visible beneath the would-be terrorist's hard exterior. "They were everything to me," Hassan said quietly. "Layla taught at the local school. She believed that education could bring peace to our region. Ahmad was her best student, always asking questions about the world beyond our village. Fatima was too young for school, but she would sit in Layla's classroom and listen to the lessons." Marcus felt the familiar weight that came with hearing stories from civilians who had been affected by military operations. He had met many families in Afghanistan who had lost loved ones to the violence that seemed to consume the region, and each story was a reminder of the human cost of warfare. "Tell us what happened to them," Marcus said, his voice carrying genuine compassion rather than professional interrogation techniques. Hassan's hands trembled as he began to speak about the day that had destroyed his world. It was a Tuesday morning in March. Layla was preparing for school, and the children were helping her organize books and supplies. "I had gone to the market in the next village to sell our goats milk and cheese." He paused, struggling with memories that were clearly still raw and painful. James waited patiently, understanding that pushing too hard would destroy the trust they were building. "When I returned home, there was nothing left," Hassan continued, tears beginning to flow down his cheeks. "The drone strike had hit our house directly. My neighbors told me that Layla and the children had been in the garden when the missile struck. They died instantly." Marcus felt a knot forming in his stomach. He had been involved in drone operations during his tours in Afghanistan, and he knew that civilian casualties were always a possibility despite the precision of modern weapons. But hearing about those casualties from someone who had lived through them made the abstract statistics painfully real. The official report said it was intelligence about a Taliban weapons cache, Hassan said, his voice growing harder. "But there were no weapons in my house. There were only books and children's toys and the family I loved more than my own life." James recognized the anger and grief that was driving Hassan's desire for revenge, but he also saw an opportunity to redirect that energy towards something more constructive than violence. "Hassan," James said carefully, "what would Layla want you to do with the rest of your life? Would she want you to spend it seeking revenge, or would she want you to honor their memory in a different way?" The question seemed to hit Hassan like a physical blow. He sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for several long minutes before responding. Layla always said that violence only creates more violence, he admitted. She believed that the only way to break the cycle was through understanding and education. But I was so angry, so lost without them, that I couldn't see any way forward except through revenge. Marcus saw an opening that might lead to the intelligence they needed while also helping Hassan find a path away from violence. The people who recruited you, Marcus said, did they care about Layla's beliefs? Did they care about what Ahmad and Fatima would have wanted for their father? Hassan's expression grew troubled. They said they understood my pain, but they only wanted to use my anger. They never asked about my family as people. They only cared about my hatred. James leaned forward, sensing that Hassan was beginning to question the organization that had recruited him. Tell us about them, James said. Tell us about the people who convinced you that killing innocent people would honor your family's memory. Hassan began to describe his recruitment by a network that preyed on grieving relatives of civilian casualties. The organization had approached him 6 months after his family's death, when he was most vulnerable to manipulation and most eager for any promise of revenge against those he blamed for his loss. They found me at the refugee camp where I was staying after losing my home, Hassan explained. A man named Abdul Rahman told me he had lost his own family to American bombs and that he had found a way to make the Americans understand the pain they had caused. Marcus and James exchanged glances, recognizing that they were beginning to gather the intelligence that could prevent future attacks. But they also understood that Hassan was trusting them with information that could put him in danger if his former associates discovered his cooperation. Abdul Rahman recruited others besides you? Marcus asked. Many others, Hassan confirmed. Men who had lost wives, fathers who had lost children, sons who had lost their parents. All of us were consumed by grief and anger, and all of us were looking for someone to blame. The picture that emerged from Hassan's description was of a sophisticated operation that identified vulnerable individuals and channeled their grief into violence. The organization provided training, funding, and operational support, but more importantly, it provided a sense of purpose and belonging to people who had lost everything. James asked about the structure of the organization, the training facilities, and the other planned attacks. Hassan provided detailed information about safe houses, communication methods, and the identities of key operatives. But he also revealed something more important: the psychological techniques the organization used to maintain loyalty and prevent defection. They taught us that anyone who tried to stop us was an enemy, Hassan explained. Police, soldiers, intelligence agents, even other Muslims who disagreed with our methods. They said that anyone who wasn't actively helping us was helping our enemies. Marcus recognized the classic isolation techniques used by extremist organizations to maintain control over their members. By cutting off all outside relationships and sources of information, the organization had made Hassan dependent on them for social connection and meaning in his life. What changed your mind tonight? James asked. What made you decide not to go through with the attack? Hassan looked at both men for a long moment before answering. You treated me like a human being, he said simply. You asked about my family, you listened to my pain, and you didn't try to tell me that my grief wasn't real. For the first time since Layla died, someone saw me as more than just an enemy or a victim. The statement carried profound implications for both soldiers. Their approach to Hassan hadn't been calculated to extract information. It had been a genuine expression of their respect for his humanity. That respect had accomplished more than any interrogation technique could have achieved. Over the next several hours, Hassan provided detailed intelligence about planned attacks, operational procedures, and the network of supporters that kept the organization functioning. But more importantly, he began to work through his grief in a way that didn't require violence or revenge. Marcus and James served as both intelligence gatherers and informal counselors, helping Hassan process his loss while extracting information that would save innocent lives. The partnership that had begun as a jurisdictional dispute had evolved into something unprecedented, a collaboration that bridged military, intelligence, and humanitarian concerns. By dawn, Hassan had provided enough information to prevent 3 coordinated attacks and identified dozens of operatives across multiple countries. But he had also begun to envision a different kind of future for himself, one that would honor his family's memory through construction rather than destruction. "I want to tell my story," Hassan said as the session concluded. "I want other men like me to understand that revenge doesn't bring back the people we love and that violence doesn't heal the pain of loss." Agent Thompson and Colonel Sterling were amazed by the quality and quantity of intelligence that had been gathered through what amounted to a conversation between soldiers rather than a formal interrogation. The success of the mission would be measured not just in prevented attacks, but in the transformation of a potential terrorist into someone who might help prevent others from following the same path. As Marcus and James prepared to return to their regular duties, both men understood that their partnership had achieved something extraordinary. They had prevented an attack, gathered critical intelligence, and, perhaps most importantly, they had demonstrated that understanding and respect could overcome even the deepest divisions of nationality, religion, and circumstance. Hassan would enter a rehabilitation program designed to help former extremists reintegrate into society. His cooperation with intelligence agencies would continue, but his real value would be as someone who could speak to other grieving relatives and help them find alternatives to violence. The partnership between Marcus and James would be officially recognized by both governments, leading to new protocols for cooperation between American and British security forces. But the real significance of their collaboration went beyond official recognition or career advancement. They had proven that soldiers from different countries and different military traditions could work together not just in combat, but in the complex tasks of understanding human psychology, building trust across cultural divides, and finding peaceful solutions to seemingly intractable conflicts. 6 months later, Marcus and James would meet again at a joint training exercise between American and British Special Forces. They would serve as instructors, teaching other soldiers how to build the kind of partnership that could bridge any gap and overcome any obstacle. But the most important lesson they had learned wasn't about military tactics or intelligence gathering. It was about the power of treating every person, even enemies, as human beings deserving of respect and understanding. That lesson would influence their careers, their relationships, and their understanding of what it truly meant to serve their countries with honor. The evening that had begun as a confrontation between 2 proud military traditions had become a demonstration of the values that united all true soldiers: courage, honor, and an unwavering commitment to protecting innocent people from those who would do them harm. Marcus and James had started as adversaries and become partners. More importantly, they had started as representatives of their respective countries and become something more valuable. Human beings working together to make the world a safer and more understanding place. Their story would be told in military academies and intelligence training programs for years to come, not as an example of perfect tactics or flawless execution, but as proof that the greatest victories come not from defeating enemies, but from finding ways to turn enemies into allies through respect, understanding, and shared commitment to something greater than national pride or personal glory. In the end, the crowd that had been stunned into silence by their initial confrontation would have been even more amazed by the partnership that grew from that moment of tension. It was a partnership that proved the best of what military service could accomplish, not through force of arms, but through force of character and the courage to see the humanity in everyone, even those who had been prepared to commit the most terrible acts of violence. The silence that had marked their first encounter had been replaced by understanding, cooperation, and a friendship that would endure long after their official duties had ended. It was a transformation that honored the best traditions of both the United States Marine Corps and the British Coldstream Guards, while pointing toward a future where such partnerships might make military conflict itself unnecessary.